The most amazing texts in the Bible. The conversion of Saul showcases the mighty power of God, almost as clearly as the resurrection itself. It appears 3 times in the book of Acts, this conversion account. Only an event of greatest importance would be repeated 3 times by an author famous for being brief. Probably the most amazing conversion in history. Luke, the author of Acts, now spotlights a homegrown terrorist of the church. There has never been a transformation in a man's life like this. In fact, Saul's life was so different after his conversion that for a long time, Christians didn't believe it. You ever feel that way? Hits the news that some famous criminal has become a Christian. And I don't know about you, but I scoff. When I first heard that Chuck Colson had converted to Christ, I didn't believe it. I wondered, how could God save anybody like him? I mean, I saw the articles about his faith, and I thought, well, let's see where he is 10 years from now. But Chuck Colson went from being one of the most power-hungry, self-serving politicians to being one of the most capable, respected spokesmen for Christ of our time. So did Saul. Look how it happened. Verses 1 and 2, Acts 9. Here we see Saul's radicalism. First verse just showcases his attitude. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. In other words, he was making menacing threats to Christians, trying to intimidate them into giving up on Jesus. When it came to Christians, Saul was mean, malicious, murderous. What made him really scary was he was also very educated. He was in a high position in both the religious and the political establishment. He could make good on his threats, and he could get away with it. On top of that, he did all this with a clear conscience. He thought he was serving God, systematically eliminating Christians, doing God a favor in his mind. He knew that there were at least 25,000 Christians in Jerusalem, and his strategy was set to wipe them out and stop the growth of the church. If he were alive today, he'd be on TV, he'd be on radio, telling Christians what awful things he was going to do to them if they didn't give up their faith in Jesus. He would write a blog, he would put it on YouTube. If he found out that a Christian lived on his block, he'd be texting them with all the gory things that were going to happen if he didn't reject Jesus. I mean, that was his attitude. A one-man terrorist cell attacking Christians. Just the mention of his name would cause any Christian of the first century to shudder. Look at his actions, 1b and 2. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus. So he's not content to harass the Christians in Jerusalem. He wants to go 140 miles away and in Damascus, give them a hard time there. He wanted the legal power to eliminate them. 2b gives us Saul's ambition, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So he wants to imprison all Christians. Often terrorists will even release women and children that they take as hostage, but not Saul. He wanted the women and the children too. Got authorization from the high priest to bring back both men and women to Jerusalem, where they all knew they didn't have a fair chance at a trial. By the way, the high priest is still Caiaphas. His rule didn't end until 36 AD. He continued in that position after playing the major role in crucifying Jesus. Saul has the full support of the high priest. Here, Saul, go to it, giving you the authority. Enter the synagogue of Damascus. So Paul stuffs those papers in his briefcase, and with a broad smile, he heads for Damascus on a mission of terror. Second, in verses 3 through 9, we see the last post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. It's to Saul on the Damascus Road. That is what it took to change this guy. It's what it took to revolutionize his life. Starts with a sudden light. Verse 3, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. So he's been walking for a week. He's about to arrive at his destination. Suddenly there's this big light flooding him. And there's no warning. Instantly he's engulfed in blinding light. And it's hard to overstate how bright this light must have been, because I am told that there is no place in the world that has brighter light than this road to Damascus. And it's daytime. It's a sunny day. According to Acts 22:6, it happened at high noon. And yet, on this bright place on earth, there's this sudden light that stuns Saul. Must have been much brighter than a flash bulb. Maybe it was like a laser beam that just kind of diffused around him. And what made it really scary, it wasn't 100 yards over there. It was all around him. He instantly realized this is supernatural. He's overwhelmed. He falls to the ground. But it's not just a light show. There's sound too. Look at verse 4. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He probably thought he was hearing a Christian. I mean, after all, that's who he's persecuting. Saul answers, "Who are you, Lord?" Now, some people think that means that he knows he's talking to Jesus, but it's probably like, "Who are you, sir?" Anybody that can bring this kind of light and this kind of power against you, you're going to call sir, right? Get this answer. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. Think about that. Paul had built his whole life on the proposition, there is no Jesus, Son of God. Creative writer gives us what might have been going on in the mind of Saul at this point. "I, Saul of Tarsus, made my own independent evaluation of this man called Jesus of Nazareth. I investigated his life to see if this leader of the Nazarene cult was worth following. I made my own intelligent evaluation of what he was worth. I was not unfair or unkind. I applied to him all the natural, normal standards by which any life is appraised. I looked first into his ancestry and discovered that there was a cloud over his birth right from the start. He was the illegitimate son of a faithless woman who had been taken in by a kind-hearted carpenter and raised as his own son. But he was an outcast from the beginning and socially worth absolutely nothing. I investigated his professional standing and found that he was born of peasant stock, had attended no schools, raised as a simple carpenter in a village of no standing in Israel, and professionally was worth absolutely nothing. As Saul of Tarsus, I investigated his ecclesiastical background. I found that he had sat at nobody's feet. He had been to no seminary. He had no theological training. In fact, he was repudiated by the theological authorities of his day. He was nothing but an incorrigible street preacher, a rabble-rouser, and as far as his professional, ecclesiastical, theological standing was concerned, he was worth absolutely nothing. Fourth, I looked into his financial standing. I found that he had no bank account. He was born in a barn, laid in a borrowed manger, lived in other people's homes all through his adult life. He was an incredible scrounger, always borrowing things. He borrowed money to pay his taxes from a fish. He borrowed his clothes from other people. He rode around on a borrowed donkey. He died on a borrowed cross and was buried in a borrowed tomb. Financially, from the standpoint of the accumulation of the world's goods, he was worth absolutely nothing. As I applied to him all the normal standards by which any life is evaluated, I found that this man was worth absolutely nothing. Jesus of Nazareth was worthless. But on the Damascus Road, something happened to me. There in the blinding flash of a moment, I looked into the face of a man, and I saw God. I discovered that he who I thought was worth nothing was the Lord of everything, the God of glory. There I found that him whom I thought to be nothing was everything, and I who thought I was everything was nothing. That's Major Ian Thomas. Fanciful, but perhaps true picture of what was going on in Saul's head. I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. He is shocked. Jesus is not dead. Paul realized, I am the dead one. He came to give me life. It's impossible to overstate the importance of this encounter. God has just knocked down and is talking to the man that he intends to use to transform the world. He will use the gospel of Christ in Rome and turn it upside down. It'll reach Caesar's household before he dies. He'll become the missionary of all missionaries. The man who writes the majority of the New Testament. But spiritually speaking, Saul's the one who's worthless at this point. He is an enemy of Jesus. Once Jesus identifies himself to Saul, he tells him what to do, 6 and 7. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what to do. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but didn't see anyone. So he's surrounded by troops. He's going to invade the Christians at Damascus, so he has the temple police with him. They just stand there dumbfounded as they hear the sound, but they're not seeing anyone. They do not understand. Some think the reason they didn't understand was that these guys were Roman soldiers, and Jesus is speaking in Hebrew to Saul. I don't know about that because it might have been temple police. But this is definitely a sight and sound show. Look at verses 8 and 9. We see the subdued persecutor. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. Look at their leader now. I mean, he was so tough before, and now he's blind. He gets up from the ground with his eyes wide open. He can't see a thing. They've just walked for a week, 140 miles. They're at their destination, but their leader is blind, and they have to lead him by the hand. You don't get much more subdued than that. What a contrast to the way Saul intended to storm into Damascus with his death-dealing letters. He is guided in as a blind man, totally helpless, on the arm of another, completely dependent on someone else to show him to a home that he might otherwise have invaded. He's so upset, he can't eat for 3 days. Remember how you felt before you knew Jesus? Can you relate to Saul's blindness? Fasting? One by one, he took them from me, all the things I valued most, till I was empty-handed. Every glittering toy was lost. I walked earth's highway, grieving in my rags and poverty, until I heard his voice inviting, lift those empty hands to me. I turned my hands toward heaven, and he filled them with a score of his own transcendent riches till they could contain no more. And at last I comprehend with my stupid mind and dull, God could not pour his riches into hands already full. That's Saul. Formerly powerful, persecutor, full, now weak, blind, and empty. Helpless after just a glimpse at the last post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. Third, in verses 10 through 16, we see the ministry of Ananias to Paul in Damascus. Meanwhile, back in Damascus, there's a Christian man who doesn't know anything about what has just happened to Saul. All he knows about Saul is there is one guy I never want to meet. I mean, it could be deadly to even come into this guy's presence. So verse 10 introduces available Ananias. In Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias? Yes, Lord, he answered. Isn't that a beautiful answer? I mean, here's a guy who doesn't even know what the Lord wants. And yes, sir, yes. It's just yes to Michigan, yes to God. And his name is so appropriate. Ananias means Jehovah is gracious. verse 10 and 11, we see an appointment set for Ananias. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas. Check. On Straight Street. Got it. Ask for a man from Tarsus. Named Saul. That's a good one, God. That is a real good joke. It's like saying, go to Cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. He's invited you for dinner. For dinner? Or I am dinner? What's going on here, God? Seriously, Lord, this has to be the first mistake you've ever made. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. I don't think it's yes anymore, God. Are you an Ananias? Are you willing to fill your calendar with appointments like this? Lord, I can't talk to him about Jesus. You ought to hear the language he uses. I can't talk to him either. He's addicted to drugs, for crying out loud. And she's an atheist. Why would I talk to her? Get serious, God. Who do you really want me to talk to? Do you expect God to send you to people who have it all together already? People who are already doing everything he wants them to do? If you're waiting for appointments like that, your appointment book is going to stay empty. Verses 13 and 14, we see an anxiety attack. Ananias is thinking, Saul of Tarsus praying? Yeah, he's praying over which weapon to use to kill people with. And why did you give him my name? Of all things, why did you give him my name? Read verses 13 and 14. Lord, Ananias answered, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. How did he know about Saul's plans to destroy the Christians in Damascus? Evidently, they had a pretty good communication system in the church. Maybe the apostles sent a runner from Jerusalem to warn the Christians at Damascus. I don't know how that happened. USA Today, a while back, carried an article that says the excuses for being late or absent to work are becoming more creative. Account Temps, a New York temp agency, polled executives asking, what's the most bizarre excuse you've ever heard? And some of the winners were, my famous actress just died and I needed some alone time. I had to sort my socks. The wind was blowing against me. A plane landed right on the highway. Couldn't get here. There was a bear on my street. And opting for honesty, one employee wrote, I just forgot to come to work. Well, Ananias opted for honesty and in essence said, this man is dangerous. I'm afraid to go. Forget about it. God's not taking no for an answer. Rather than shout at him and make him more afraid to face the wrath of God than to face Saul, God offers Ananias assurance of success. Look at verse 15. But the Lord said to Ananias, go. And notice that God does not bring Saul to Ananias. He sends Ananias to Saul. And that's how it always works. People don't come on our terms. We have to go to them on their turf, on their terms. They don't get their lives straightened out, and then we come in, and then they come to us and come right into the church, and we put the finishing touches on their relationship with the Lord. We have to go with them down in the dirty and get it started. And they don't look the part. They don't talk right. They don't smell good in some cases. They don't think straight, but they need the Lord, and we're to go. God said, go. This man is my chosen instrument. Isn't that wonderful? Saul is a baby Christian. He's just a few hours old, but God has already chosen him. You see, God sees us not for what we are, but for what we will become. No need to be overwhelmed with guilt. God sees you for what you will become. Have a bad background? Forget about it. Just let Jesus lead. There's always a clean slate. There's always grace with God. Look at the ministry God had for Saul. To carry my name to the Gentiles. What irony that God would use this dyed-in-the-wool member of the central sect of the Jews, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as his special emissary to the Gentile world. But he was a good choice. He had the education, the keen mind, the zeal to reach out to all people, the tenacity to do the difficult. Verse 15 goes on to say that Saul would carry God's name before kings. Hey, he's going to minister to the up and out. And before the people of Israel. He's a natural for that one. Trained in the Old Testament, he can say with authority, I've studied it. Jesus is the Messiah. Saul would love those first three assignments. Carry the gospel to Gentiles? Radical. Carry the gospel to kings? Exciting. Carry the gospel to Israel? Wow, home folk. I love it. And then comes verse 16. And I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. Some of us are to be instruments of suffering as we bear Christ's name. Some of us are experiencing that right now. We're wrestling with suffering and we can't figure out why. And it just seems we could be so much more effective for God if we were healthy and if we were wealthy. God has us right where he wants us. He knows exactly how he wants to use us, and he knows what he's doing. Think for a moment of the people who suffered to minister to you. It doesn't take too much thinking on Memorial Day Sunday. Well, that's the ministry of Ananias in Damascus. He's shocked, he's scared by what God's told him to do, but he's reassured, and he's ready to be used any way God sees fit. Fourth, in verses 17 through 19, we see the encouragement of Paul by Ananias. 17. Then Ananias went to the house and entered it. Placing his hands on Saul, he said, Brother Saul. Can you believe that? I mean, first sight, Ananias recognizes Saul as a brother. He looks at this man who has had a hand in killing his fellow Christians, and he realizes with God's help and God's hand in the mix, he's now a brother. The church gained Paul through the brotherliness of Ananias. I wonder what wonderful future leader the church will be produced by your kindness. You ever think the impact your kindness could have on one of the kids in the nursery or all the way up to middle school? What could the church in the future be because of your kindness to one of these future leaders? Do you have what it takes to treat that obnoxious, aggressive person at work like a brother or a sister? May just be another Saul waiting to become a Paul. Look what Ananias said. Brother Saul, the Lord who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes and he could see again. He got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, regained his strength. Now that is an understatement. Don't you think there was more to it than this? Don't you think there were shouts of joy and cheers of victory as Christians at Damascus saw come up out of that water, a friend and a fellow believer? God had delivered them from imprisonment and death and had transformed their persecutor into a proclaimer of Christ. That is one of the most marvelous miracles in the Bible. This man has spent his entire life studying Scripture from a whole other frame of reference. His whole theological system was off base as far as God was concerned, but he took his stand boldly. If you're going to make a mistake, make it big and loud. His thinking and his life had to be turned inside out. He was going south when God wanted him to go north. He was living and acting and motivated by hate. And when he came up out of that water of Christian baptism, Ananias hugged him and he began to live his life motivated by love. Fanny Crosby was blind, but saw more than most of us see with our eyes wide open, and she left so many marvelous old hymns. And the third stanza of one of my favorites goes, down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings lie buried that grace can restore. Touched by a loving heart, weakened by kindness, chords that are broken will vibrate once more. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful. Jesus can save. Saul is accepted into a whole new family, the family of God called the church. Look at the end of verse 19, the next section. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. And what a wonderful time of spiritual growth that must have been. I think what God has done in my own life, how I got wonderful love and acceptance from childhood through now by the church. When I was young and brash and obnoxious, Christians put their arm around me and loved me anyhow. Every new Christian needs that, especially the Saul turned Paul types. Those people did a lot of forgiving. Maybe one of those people's mother had been put in jail by Saul. Maybe one of them had a dad who was killed by Saul. Maybe Stephen's orphan kids were there. What forgiveness in the church at Damascus. But more than that, what forgiveness we see in God. He's the hound of heaven. You know that one? Francis Thompson lived years ago in England. He was a loser, a failure. He wrestled with life trying to become a Roman Catholic priest and failed. He tried to become a medical doctor, but failed. He joined the army. They kicked him out in just a few days. He couldn't get along with his parents. He couldn't get along with his friends. Finally, he just became a vagrant in downtown London. He was addicted to opium. He lived on booze and garbage that he found in the alleys of the city. He was, in his own words, here's his own words, in the pit of squalor, no shirt beneath my tattered coat, bare feet and broken shoes, I was a worthless waif of a man. But beneath that shirtless chest was a heart God sought. And he tracked this loser until he found him. And lo and behold, Thompson had a tremendous ability to write poetry. And Francis Thompson wrote what many critics consider to be the grandest ode ever printed, The Hound of Heaven. This mystical poem about God pictures God as a hound pursuing a man who is running from him. Every person here today is known by God. Some of you don't realize it, but God is pursuing you right now. You don't see the hound of heaven, and you don't hear him. But he has ways of making himself known. And suddenly, the chase is over, and you're caught. Down the streets of every city, up the walks into suburban homes, down the halls of high-rise and otherwise apartments and in offices and schools, the Lord, the hound of heaven, pursues the lost. Is that you? If you're lost, I'll guarantee you this, God is at work right now to find you. Some of you don't know it, but the hound of heaven is nipping right at your heels. Have you scratched out your mate? Think there's no hope there? Don't do it. God specializes in mates. How about that outspoken, smart-aleck, sacrilegious kid in your class? You praying for an early death with that one? Why not pray for conversion? God's good at smart-alecks. Got one talking to you right now. And he's good at you too. He knows that one chink in your obstinate armor, he'll get to you. It's just a matter of time. And for some of you, the time is now. Accept the forgiveness of Jesus. Accept the fellowship of believers. By faith, turn your back on sin. Make Jesus the boss of your life. Be baptized. Get a fresh start with God. You'll have the hope of heaven hereafter and the joy of serving Jesus here. People are funny creatures. We run faster when we're lost. Maybe you're out of breath this morning running from God. You don't even know why you took time in your busy schedule to come here on a Memorial Day weekend, for crying out loud. But God knows why you're here. It's no more accidental than what happened to Saul on the road to Damascus. See, we're not studying ancient history here. The same thing is happening to Saul-like people all over the world today. The question is, will you let it happen to you? God will call off. The hounds of heaven will call off as soon as you invite him into your life. And it's wonderful. You find forgiveness and forever friends. Why don't you come and get it as we stand and sing?